The art and science of ideal swim technique explained from your perspective. As we alternate between jargon and plain language, this guide will unfold in three levels of complexity. With that being said, let's head to our first part. Every great swimmer operates within the constraints of human anatomy. With this, we can imply that every position assumed in swimming can be seen as a set of anatomical arrangements. These actions can be seen as elements cataloged into different sets. Think of it as two drawings in a flipbook. A body part moves from point A to point B to create an action. If you compile these actions, you get the assets needed to build a swim stroke. But before we hop on to that, let's examine these assets, these elements that we need. Actions grouped in level 1 relate to spinal movements that affect torso positions. Core compression allows the torso to brace into a compact position by bringing the chest and hips into a central point. The chest is above the abdominals, while the hips are below, so when they come together to brace, the effect of core compression is achieved. Our main movers are the abdominal muscles with vertical fibers, which orient the direction of muscular pull. Core extension, on the other hand, allows the torso to lengthen in posture. This action can be likened to stretching a spring to increase tension. The spinal erector muscles allow for the spinal extension, while the transverse abdominis adds abdominal tension. If we take one of those spinal muscles, then bring back the obliques mentioned earlier, we get the action of torso rotation. For something to twist, there has to be a point of stability and a point of mobility. In this case, the hips provide stability and the torso provides the mobility. That completes the actions for level 1. Now let's proceed to level 2 for the actions of the scapula and the hips. Scapular movements are labeled based on the position of the scapula relative to the spine. We can move up and down, out and in, tilt back, and tilt forward. The standard labels for these actions are shown on the screen. These actions can also synergize to create complex movements. The push and raise group allows you to support overhead actions like this salute. Observe how the muscle fiber direction indicates where the scapula will move. The traps elevate the scapula, while the serratus anterior tilts the scapula in a favorable position. On the other hand, the down and back group supports pulling movements. Pulling the hands behind your back is an example of combining the actions from this group. The rhomboids retract, the lats and pecs pull down, and the levator scapulae tilts the scapula in a favorable position. That completes the upper body actions for level 2. For our lower body counterpart, we have two actions of interest. Hip flexion closes the angle of the hips, while hip extension straightens this angle. For hip flexion, the muscles of interest include the psoas and the hip flexors. For hip extension, it is the glute max and hamstrings that are involved. Before these actions can be functional, however, they have to combine with actions from succeeding levels. The upper body counterpart for level 3 is the upper arm or humerus that can rotate toward the midline or away from the midline. The lower body counterpart for level 3 is the femur or thigh that can also rotate toward the midline or away from the midline. Now let's see what we can piece together so far, starting with the overhead pushing group. To differentiate between the two, we figure out if the limbs are aiming for the midline or if it is just moving parallel to the midline. When using the shoulder abduction path, the arm is being abducted by the midline. For shoulder flexion, the goal is to close this angle, which allows the arm to raise overhead. The difference is that the arms do not intend to touch the midline and simply moves parallel to the midline, as if reaching for the back of the head. It is important to note that shoulder abduction is not exclusive to actions that start from the side, and shoulder flexion is not exclusive to actions that start from the front. You can start at the front and end up aiming for the midline. Or you can start close to your side but end up reaching for the back of the head. This is an important concept when it comes to understanding the extension phase of all four strokes. Let's explore the shoulder flexion group. The arms recover to the side for the butterfly stroke, but as it moves overhead, the arms end up reaching behind the head. This is done to keep the momentum forward while undulation takes place. If the arms are allowed to crash into the midline instead, the undulation will have no counterbalance. For the backstroke, the shoulder abduction path can reinforce the bad habit of overreaching as a form of compensation. If we add the core movements, we can further see the composite of actions required for proper technique. The next pair is where the opposite is true. Aiming for the midline is encouraged for a tighter streamline. Again, it is the end position that determines the path. The case is such with breaststroke overhead action, where the hands start at the front but ends up squeezing the arms together for proper streamlining. Compared to butterfly undulation, breaststroke is relatively straightforward, which means that the swimmer can focus more on keeping the drag profile as narrow as possible. The shoulder abduction path is also appropriate for the extension phase of freestyle for the same reason of drag reduction. Because the arms cycle in front of the swimmer for freestyle, it is easier to figure out that the head is the boundary between left and right. For all four strokes, the scapula is in its pushing and racing role, which means that we need the combined effort of the delts, serratus anterior, and trapezius. But because of muscle fiber orientation, shoulder abduction will emphasize more of the deltoids, while shoulder flexion will bring in the front delts and upper chest more. This is of course on top of the muscles earlier like the traps and serratus that allow for smooth overhead action in all directions. Now let's explore the pulling group. For shoulder adduction, the combined effort of the lats and the pecs adduct the shoulder to the midline. For shoulder extension, the lats, rear delts, and even the long head of the tricep extends the angle of the shoulder and the upper arm. If this seems familiar, then yes, these actions are the reverse of each other, and so are these. So if breaststroke extension is a form of shoulder abduction, then we complete the cycle with its other half, with shoulder adduction. Adducting to the midline ensures that the bull stays in front of the body for the breaststroke. Observe how the cyclic pattern of abduction and adduction takes place. Abduction on top, adduction on the bottom. For freestyle, the same pairing is true since we start with shoulder abduction and pull in with shoulder adduction. Because of the nature of the catch, core rotation and internal rotation has to be involved. Conveniently, the pecs and the lats used in adduction can also function as internal rotators given a specific position. Without sweep actions that move away from the midline, there is a sensation of wing spreading that occurs because of the resistance that the upper body encounters during the early parts of the pull. Think of it as scraping this imaginary bowl to get the most out of your outsweep. By changing our orientation, this cue can also hold true for the freestyle. That's our breaststroke and freestyle pulling pattern. Now let's look at the next pair. We have established earlier that shoulder flexion is the appropriate path for butterfly. We have also established that shoulder extension is the reverse of shoulder flexion. Compared to the breaststroke pull, the butterfly is directed forward and low to the water, hence the shoulder extension path. The elbow bend here makes it look like the hands are heading for the midline. But remember that the hands are still attached to the upper arm, which has to pull parallel to the midline to keep the stroke moving forward. The scapula, of course, is attached to the arm and is very crucial to perform this pulling action. Since we are using the down and back group, we expect these muscles to activate. Compared to the breaststroke, however, which will involve the chest more, there will be more emphasis on the back muscles for the fly because of the direction of the pull relative to the midline. The shoulder extension path is also appropriate for backstroke for two reasons. First, we have established earlier that shoulder flexion is most appropriate for backstroke. So it would make sense to pair it with its reverse of shoulder extension. Second, the shoulder and the arm have to dig back to keep the hands in the water during the rotation. To summarize the pulling cycles, we have our parallel cycle that always moves parallel to the midline but never into it. Then we have our midline group which intends to circle in and out of the midline. In preparation for the next major concept of rhythm and timing, let's finish this discussion with lower body kicking. In both land and water movements, the lower body has a wind up phase and an action phase. If land exercises can be categorized into a spectrum of glute dominant and quad dominant movements, then that's the context that we'll use to discuss kicks too. Based on the fibers of these big muscle groups, you can already tell that the glute dominant movements will have the intention of drawing the legs closer to the midline, while the quad dominant movements have the intention of moving along the midline vertically, but not into it. Breaststroke kicks, for example, require the insoles of the feet to whip together, which makes it appropriate for the glutes to take the lead. Even if the quads are in a great position too, relying on them will cause the kick to be wide. The quads, however, are better leveraged for flutter kicks and dolphin kicks that require the front of the foot to flick the water. But let's not forget that we are still connected to a higher segment, namely the hips. Because these kicks have a whip-like action, identifying the wind-up phase can get tricky. This part here is where the external rotators of the hips act as a rubber band resistance or a braking mechanism to stop the legs from going further. This sudden stopping of direction is what flicks the feet. At this point, the quads are not yet in action because the knees are still extended. But as the glutes and external rotators continue to wind up the legs, the hips will go into internal rotation to position the feet. Additionally, the ankles will invert to maximize the traction of the foot on the water. The same whipping mechanism is used for flutter kicks, just with alternating directions. In this frame, we can see that one foot is positioned for maximum resistance against the water because of how internal rotation sets up the entire leg. On the other leg, the external rotators are slamming on the brakes to whip the foot. Then it's just a matter of alternating between the legs. All of this information will lead us to many unexplored implications for training, so subscribe to stay updated.